Well, good morning. Can I welcome everybody to the 24th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2023. The first item on our agenda is for members of the committee to consider whether or not to take agenda items 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 in private. Are we all agreed? Yes, we are agreed. The main item on our agenda this morning is to take evidence on the Auditor General's report into adult mental health, which was co-written along with the Accounts Commission. So I'm very pleased to welcome our witnesses this morning, Auditor General Stephen Boyle. Lee Johnson is here from Audit Scotland, where she's a senior manager. Eva Thompson-Tudo is an audit manager at Audit Scotland, and I'm pleased that we're joined by Christine Lester from the Accounts Commission. We've got a large number of questions to ask this morning, but before we get on to those, Auditor General, can I ask you to make a short opening statement?
Of course. Many thanks, Convener. Good morning, Committee. I'm pleased to bring the Committee our Joint Performance Audit Report on Adult Mental Health Services in Scotland. Our report highlights that many people find accessing mental health services to be slow and a complicated process. The system is both complex and fragmented, with multiple organisations involved in planning, funding and providing adult mental health. The availability of services also varies across Scotland. Further, some groups, such as people from ethnic minorities and those from rural areas, face additional barriers to accessing support. Progress in addressing mental health inequalities has been slow, but mental health services cannot address these issues alone. Our report is clear that they need to work more closely with other sectors such as housing, welfare and employability support to address and prevent the social detriments of poor mental health that affect around 1 in 4 people in Scotland each year. Over the past 3 years, people have also grappled with the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the more recent cost of living crisis. These effects have put an additional strain on the mental health of people in Scotland. More than £1 billion is spent on adult mental health each year, but our report highlights the challenges in assessing the impact of that spending due to limited financial, workforce and operational data. The Scottish Government focuses on waiting times for psychological therapies to assess performance of adult mental health services. However, it does not report on the quality of services or the outcomes for people receiving mental health support. The Scottish Government recognises these limitations and is planning to publish new standards that aims to address some of these gaps. While our report sets out many issues that need to be addressed, it also highlights positive developments. The Distress Brief Intervention (DBI) programme has improved the care available for people experiencing distress. NHS 24 has established a 111 mental health hub during the pandemic and then expanded that to operate 24 hours a day. The Scottish Government has set ambitious mental health commitments for the end of this Parliament, including increasing mental health funding by 25%, that 10% of frontline spending will be on mental health, and increasing mental health and wellbeing support in primary care settings. But, Convener, these commitments are not on track to be achieved. The Scottish Government and COSLA has recently published a new joint mental health and wellbeing strategy. It recognises that a whole system approach is needed to effectively support mental health and wellbeing, but much more detail is now needed on how and when outcomes identified will be achieved. The Scottish Government plans to set out this detail in a delivery plan and workforce action plan expected this autumn. We'll continue, of course, to monitor their progress against this and the wider recommendations in the report. Convener, Lee, Eva and Christine, myself, will do our utmost to answer the committee's questions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Can I go back to the kind of starting point of the audit? And the question that you set yourself was, how effectively are adult mental health services across Scotland being delivered? How would you summarise your answer to that critical question?
So I think it's fairly clear from our findings in the report that it's difficult to form an overall assessment. You'll see from the report, Convener, that the lack of effective data information to inform assessment of outcomes is really limited, much more so than we would expect. That there isn't clear information on finance, performance and outcomes effectively limits the assessment that can be made. We dug deeper during the course of the audit, and colleagues can, of course, develop my response, to bring in the views of service users of mental health services. And that led us, drawing on their assessment and the assessment of a wide range of practitioners, that what we have is a fragmented system in Scotland for the delivery of mental health services that's slow. And as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, unequal in places. So there is evidence, as we set in a number of exhibits, that you don't get the same range of service or pace of services of mental health in Scotland, depending on where you live or from which group in society you are part of.
Thanks. I'm going to come on and ask about those focus groups in a second. But before I do that, I mean, paragraph 15 in the report sets out the scale of the challenge that we face when it talks about really what appear to be almost epidemic proportions. 22% of the adult population may have a psychiatric disorder. You talk about the huge expansion in pressure and demand on services. So the number of police incidents relating to mental health increased by 62%. The Scottish Association for Mental Health reporting a 50% increase in demand on its information services, and the number of calls to NHS 24's 111 line in mental health hub increased by 436%. I mean, these are startling figures, aren't they, which are placing presumably huge pressure on the system. So we may not have measured the outcomes, but we know something about the scale of the demand which there is. Do you want to tell us something a bit more about what qualitative information you got from the focus groups you met, and what that told you about their experience?
Yeah, I'll bring Eva in to say a bit more, and Lee, if she wishes to, just to set out for the committee, perhaps maybe firstly a rationale for bringing in a focus group and users, and then also what they told us, and alongside triangulating that with the qualitative evidence that exists. And as I mentioned, just managing expectations somewhat, that qualitative evidence tends to be around psychological therapies as being the principal method with which Scottish Government and their partners are measuring the effectiveness of mental health services. But I'll pass to Eva first and then bring in Lee.
Thanks, Auditor General. So I think one of the things that we found with the focus groups was that it really brought to life some of the challenges that we'd been finding as part of our other audit work. And so it was really useful to get that sort of examples from real life about how the challenges that we've identified are affecting people trying to get support for their mental health. And what we recognise is that we spoke to relatively a small number of people, about 25 people, I think, across a few focus groups. So we weren't able to make overarching judgments based on the evidence that we got from a small number of people. But what it was really useful for was illustrating the points that we had found evidence for to bring that to life a bit. So you'll see we've put quotes throughout the report to kind of just illustrate those points a bit more fully. Yeah.
I don't know whether Lee, you want to come in?
I guess the only thing I would add is I guess they just reinforced how slow and complicated it is to access services, express their often frustration with trying to get the right kind of help and support that they needed at the right time.
Thank you, and that's a theme that I think we'll return to during the course of the morning. But I'm going to turn now to Colin Beattie, who's got some questions to put to you. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. General, there's a couple of areas I'd like to cover. One is a long-standing favourite, data collection. I think you're now the third Auditor General whose time has repeatedly highlighted the issues about data collection right across the public sector. And, it's disappointing that we've still got this problem, in particular with mental health. I mean, it's a central theme in your report. I mean, we don't really know how much is being spent on adult mental health services. We don't know the outcomes, the qualities related to mental health services. We don't know what really what the demand is even. Do you have a view on whether there's any areas that should be prioritised from what must be a long list of deficiencies to improve the data and information that's available? Because, you know, resources in any part of the public sector at the moment are quite tight, so they need to be targeted where they're going to benefit the most. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, many thanks, Mr Beattie. Firstly, to agree with you that the quality of data information has been a recurring theme from my predecessors and me and Audit Scotland's reporting for many years. It is disappointing that we are preparing another audit report that is again reporting that we don't have enough information, but nor do decision makers have enough information to gauge the impact of considerable sums of public spending. So I think just to highlight, we broadly know what's being spent on adult mental health services. So we are in the realms of £1.4 to £1.5 billion each year on spending, but that the focus on assessing its impact is very narrow on psychological therapies and important, but only one element of adult mental health service provision. What we don't know is how effective that's been. Did it improve the outcomes for people accessing those services? I would also agree with the point you make that we are in a challenging fiscal environment. And I'll say a bit more, but I'm keen to bring Christine in, actually, who might want to say a bit more about where the Scottish Government and their partners go next with this. Because it is going to require a whole system effort. And the point in terms of prioritisation is that, so there are signs of progress in that Scottish Government and COSLA have set out their new strategy for the delivery of services and their intent that this is underpinned by a clear delivery plan. That's absolutely fundamental to assessing the impact of mental health spending and what outcomes have been achieved. Additional context for that is you'll know, of course, committee, that the fiscal environment that Scotland is operating is very challenging. That will require difficult choices. And that's alongside some of the changes that are taking place in the relationship between the Scottish Government and local government with the assertion of the Verity House Agreement earlier this summer that intends to remove some of the fiscal constraints in terms of reporting on individual budget lines between local authorities and the Scottish Government. But as part of that overall consideration, there has to be absolute clarity about what a costed delivery plan can achieve. I'm keen to broaden it out to Christine. I'm sure she'll want to comment on that too.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think what it boils down to is we know there's this huge sum of money at the top, but we really can't recognise at the bottom how it's then divvied up and gets to the service end. And I think that's the issue. It's very complicated at that service end. So in terms of the work that the Accounts Commission do through local authorities, integration joint boards, and then also the third sector and health and social care partnerships are all delivering those services. But we don't actually know the monies that are then spent individually, how they're actually impacting over a period of time, because these are commissioned services quite often in the third sector. So it's complicated. It takes a long time to get mentally ill to the point that you need to use these services, and then it takes a long time to get better again. So that being able to deliver services over a bigger timescale than 12, 18 months is really hugely important at that point. I hope that sort of helps in some way.
You did touch on something interesting there of the 1.4 billion or so. What proportion of that goes to the third sector?
So just checked to Colin, I think Eva's just looking for the figure on that in terms of the allocation of resources. So it will be really varied, Mr Beattie, so that across, at a high level, 1.2 billion is spent on is allocated to NHS boards. We have another 200,000 or so, 200 million to local authorities, and then a similar amount within the Scottish Government Mental Health Directorate. And what we've seen, I think, particularly over the course of the pandemic, is a significant increase in the Mental Health Directorate spend. Part of that were COVID-related funds. So I think, as Christine says, there are a number of funds that operate to provide mental health services, different types of interventions that are required. But across the piece, we don't yet have the data or the evaluation of the spending to say, did that make an impact, whether it was in the third sector, NHS boards or local authorities. So it's a complex system, but not enough evaluation of whether it's made a difference. Again, I'll just invite Eva in if we have more detail on the specifics of the third sector.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's quite a difficult question to answer. So, as Stephen kind of set out, the way that the funding is distributed, some of it's spent centrally by Scottish Government, some of it's allocated to NHS boards. Councils also spend a proportion of money on mental health as well. And I think within those, so for instance, NHS boards will commission services through the third sector to deliver services, and we don't have the detail about how much is spent on commission services, for instance, right now. But there are some pots of money that do go to the third sector that we are aware of. So, for instance, part of the centrally spent amount by Scottish Government Mental Health Directorate has gone on the recovery and renewal funding, and part of that was Community Mental Health and Wellbeing Fund that we talk about in the report in paragraph 71. And some of that will have gone to the third sector and distributed by third sector interfaces, and we touch on that in the report. But it's very difficult to give an overall figure about how much mental health spending as a whole goes to the third sector.
Obviously, my concern about trying to evaluate the outcomes and so on through the third sector are that they're very difficult to get information from in terms of auditing to validate these outcomes, because I know the Auditor General is limited in what he can do there. I think the key thing here is that if we don't know what the outcomes are across the board, then we don't know if the money is being spent in the right place, and that's the key I take away from that.
Yeah, we'd agree. So what we have is considerable sums of public spending. We know where it's been allocated to, but we don't know whether they have made a difference as intended. If I may, just to develop the point about the third sector briefly, and we refer to this in the report, Mr Beattie, is that the third sector play an enormously important role in the provision of adult mental health services, prevention supports across a range of different factors and geographies. One of the factors they tell us, though, is that, and this is not unique to adult mental health services, is that their funding cycle is almost always on an annual basis. So there is a challenge for them to recruit, retain people who can provide skilled services when there is that uncertainty. If we are making a step change, which I hope we do, in the provision of adult mental health services, the accountability, the funding and the outcomes, that needs to be given careful thought to about giving practitioners in the third sector certainty about how they can apply their work over a longer space of time.
The old difficulty with that is the Scottish Government's only funded on an annual basis also, so there's some uncertainty as to what the figures will be.
I think that's fair, but perhaps up to a point, the Scottish Government and local authorities will generally know from year to year what their baseline is, and they'll have certainty that they will get a sum of money generally around the amount they had last year, but it takes much longer for that certainty to be given to the third sector. So I think that there is something to be done in that arena too.
I'll take your point on that. Let me move on to another area. Scottish Government's emergency budget review. What impact has that made on the delivery of mental health and wellbeing in primary care services?
So I'll bring Eva in actually just to set out for the committee in a bit more detail. I think you're referring to paragraph 32 and the circumstances of the Scottish Government's review of its spending plans during 2022, when it identified, I think some Audit Scotland reporting around about the same time, that it had challenges to deliver a balanced fiscal position, which you referred to, they are required to do each year. Part of that analysis was to look at different budget lines and to stop spending where it was identified that either the budget wasn't needed or that it was going to be underspent. I'll ask Eva to say a bit more about some of the numbers and what judgments we've been able to make, caveated with, well, we've talked about already some of the limited availability of data to make some of those assessments. Eva.
Thank you, Auditor General. So the EBR cut funding for mental health services by about 38 million last year, and primary care funding by 65 million. And the impact of that was that local areas who were kind of trying to develop these primary care mental health and wellbeing services by 2026 were unable to recruit some of the positions that they were hoping to in that year. And so it's yet that's one of the main kind of reasons we've made the judgment that commitment to establish these primary care mental health and wellbeing services by 2026 is currently not on track, because that progress has been delayed.
Your report recommended that the government should publish a costed delivery plan setting out the funding and workforce needed to achieve its aim of a sustainable and effective mental health and well-being in primary care services. And I think the target date for that was 2026. What confidence do you have that that recommendation is progressing? Are they actually actively doing this?
So we know that work is underway to do so, and there are planned publications over the course of the autumn of this year. This has to be a very comprehensive, clear, transparent document, Mr. Beattie, that sets out how funding, performance, and workforce will be delivered across a range of different service providers. And they have to get it right, I think, is the blunt assessment that I would make. There have been mental health strategies before. We touch on this in the report as well, together with interim progress reports that haven't always given the level of clarity or accountability on how public spending on mental health services have performed. We hope that the judgment and the recommendation that the Council Commission and I have made in this report is acted upon, because it's absolutely essential that, not just for accountability purposes, but building on a number of conversations that the committee have had over many years, that the most effective public spending will be upstream, preventative spending that will be less costly and more effective. If we are continuing to service a system that is secondary, acute, reacting to crisis, it will be more expensive. We'll have the circumstances that we lay out in the report, where there are real workforce challenges in different parts of mental health provision and in different pockets of Scotland. So we hope that it is, and for the committee's assurance, we'll continue to track and monitor the progress that's made with a costed delivery plan.
Mm-hmm. Just on another aspect, on paragraph 37, you highlighted some of the issues that, in fact, you spoke about in your opening statement, which are the inequalities. And, there are certainly many inequalities in mental health. So if there's a clear link between mental health inequality and inequalities in society, can you maybe give us a bit more information about what your audit work found in that area? Because, it does encompass a broad number of factors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I'm sure Eva and Christine will both want to say a word or two about this as well. At a headline level, we found that there are some quite stark inequalities in the provision of adult mental health services. And so not just the rural disparities that exist in terms of the provision of service. We also found, and I'm sure will come as no surprise to the committee, that if you are from a deprived area of Scotland, your access isn't equivalent and your outcomes aren't the equivalent of some of the more affluent parts of the country. In our report, we also note that for people from ethnic minority background, there are language barriers to accessing services, and some of that has also been impacted by the provision of either face-to-face or remote service provision. Where it's led us to, Mr Beattie, is really an assessment of this large, complex and at times fragmented system. I mentioned in my opening statement that adult mental health service providers themselves cannot resolve this. This is a multifaceted, complex area of public service. It is going to require a clear plan, prioritisation, governance, accountability, all of those things from across local authorities, health service, Scottish Government, third sector and housing providers, so that we are able to have a much more person-centred, preventative model of mental health services in Scotland. And it also, just to last point before handing over to colleagues, gets the information right so that a system as complex as this inevitably will continue to need tweaks and evaluation. But if we don't have the information to make that assessment in the first place, I fear that what we continue to do is just to keep spending year after year without that rounded assessment of what difference it's making. I'll perhaps turn to, sorry.
Before you do hand over to Eva, maybe we could broaden that out a little bit in your response, because paragraph 39 says that the Scottish Government recognises the importance of addressing inequalities in mental health, but you state also that the impact of its commitments are not always clear. So perhaps in the response you could include how the Scottish Government is going to address these concerns.
That's correct. Actually, I think I have noted that the Government has recognised and is making some progress. What we want to see is that progress built upon with a clear, costed delivery plan that sets out how they intend to deliver upon their commitments. The report, again, I'll pass to colleagues in a second, but maybe before I do, just to mention one of the key drivers that the Government intends to enact change in mental health service provision through a more upstream preventative approach is investment in primary care services. So their intention is that mental health workers will be based in all GP practices in Scotland by 2026. What we've identified in the report through the work we've done is that that is at risk without the clear pathway through spending workforce performance information to get to that point. I'm sure the committee will want to come on and talk further about workforce challenges, but it's an absolutely essential component of that. So you're correct, Mr Beattie, that the Government is recognising and has plans. But I would, my caution is that successive governments have had plans, but what's not followed through is the detailed costed plan from how to get to, from a strategy to implementation that can be evaluated upon. Maybe go to Christine first.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I think having a national plan is fantastic and all very well and very much needed, as we've said. But Scotland's a very diverse place. So if you live where I live in rural Moray, the mental health problems that we have there are very different to the mental health problems you might see in Glasgow or Dundee or somewhere like that. So the delivery of the services has to be done at a local level. And I think we go back to what we were talking about how these services are commissioned in the third sector, because they're very much tailored to the individual requirements of that particular locality. And I think therein the problem, isn't it? Is that route through which the money has to go to get there is complicated. Eva, mentioned that that money that goes to the NHS is then used to commission services. Well, those services are mainly commissioned at local level through integration giant boards through their strategic commissioning plans. and then implemented from then on. So they're very, very diverse and very different. If you go back to then inequality, then inequalities are different. So rural poverty, cost of living, where I live, is very different. It's fuel poverty and things like that, very different to the sort of poverty you maybe see in inner cities. So, and then when it all comes together, when you've got the intersectionality of, you know, you've got poverty, you've got an ethnic minority, you've got a physical disability along with your mental disability, it all comes together very often. And those people are very much in crisis. But they're probably known to one or all of the organisations who are tasked by the government to look after them. By that I mean housing, GP services, etc. So you can see how complicated it becomes at that level. Community planning partnerships have a role in that, I feel.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess just a couple of things to mention. So in 2020, the Scottish Government published the Mental Health Transition and Recovery Plan in response to the impact of the pandemic on mental health. And that was quite clear about its kind of recognition of inequalities as being a significant issue. And so it set out actions to try and tackle some of those inequality relating to employment, women and girls' mental health and socioeconomic inequalities. But what we say in the report is that the plan didn't outline timescales for all of the actions and hasn't carried out a review of progress of that plan. And one other thing to mention is that the new mental health and wellbeing strategy that was published earlier this year also had quite a significant focus on addressing inequalities. But as the Auditor General mentioned earlier in his response, there's very little detail in that strategy about how exactly it's going to tackle that. And that's why it's intending to publish, the Scottish Government's intending to publish a delivery plan for that mental health and wellbeing strategy this autumn. And that, we're hoping, will include some of the detail about how exactly it's going to tackle some of those inequalities.
Thank you. Thank you, Vera.
Thanks very much. I'm going to bring Graham Simpson in a minute, but can I just take you back to the emergency budget review, just to fully understand what you're saying? Because Auditor General, you said the exercise was about identifying underspends and rationing the public finances according to that. But then when Eva Thomas-Tudor spoke about it, she said that, as I interpret what you said, that exercise has knocked off track the targeted support, for example, for GPs by 2026. So was that going to be underspent, and that was the reason why this £38 million cut was made? Or has the £38 million cut caused the assessment that you've made that it's not going to be on track?
So I think it's potentially both those things, Convener. And I recall, I think the Finance and Public Administration Committee took evidence from the former Deputy First Minister on some of the emergency budget decisions. I would need to refer back to the official report just to check the precise explanations. What we've seen from our work and our own assessment is, though, that the emergency budget review was, at an overarching level, designed to look at areas of spend that the government assessed weren't progressing, either through not having the demand as intended, or that they needed to deprioritise for other areas of spend in order to deliver financial balance. So I may need to come back to the committee on writing just on the precision of that.
Okay, but it's possible it was deprioritised then, is it?
So I think it's possible, but
yeah.
I would need to check.
Yeah, thank you. Graham Simpson. Graham.
Thanks a lot, Convener. Auditor General, I mean, you've spelled out quite a number of quite stark statistics here, and the first one that you use in your key facts is about 1 in 4 people experience mental health problems in any given year. Now, given that we've already discussed the difficulty of getting data, how do we know that?
So you're right, Mr. Simpson. There is a potential, and a very real potential, that the statistics that are quoted, both in terms of the scale of mental health challenges as 1 in 4. The report also notes that the Mental Health Foundation 2019 estimated that the cost of mental health mental ill health was approaching £9 billion per year to the Scottish economy. But I think, as you're alluding to, the fact that there isn't sufficient, robust, reliable data means that these are estimates, and the possibility that it's either an unmet need in society for some services that goes alongside the numbers that are reported. So perhaps this illustrates the scale of challenges, of course, exacerbated by COVID-19.
So really, we can't really say with any certainty that 1 in 4 people in any given year suffer mental health problems, because that would mean that in this room maybe 3 or 4 people suffer mental health problems this year. No, I just don't know how we could possibly know that.
Well, Eva can set out for the committee some of the sources that we drew on to arrive at that. Eva.
Thank you, Auditor General. So that particular figure comes from the Scottish Household Survey, which is carried out each year, and that one estimated that about 1 in 4 people in any given year would experience a mental health problem. So it's based on survey responses.
Wow. Well, what sort of question would you be asking to arrive at that?
I'd have to check the specific wording on that one, but that's also where the figure 4, where we've estimated how many people may have a psychiatric disorder. That's where that's come from as well. So I can find out the specific wording for you. Perhaps we can get back to you on that. But it's essentially based on survey response.
Perhaps just to lend some weight to that, Mr Simpson. We draw on a range of sources for our report, but and recognising again that the quality of data isn't what we would like it to be, not just for our purposes, but really for those that are making the decisions on how on public spending and service provision. One of the data gaps that exist and is explored by the committee in previous sessions is on primary care services. So GP consultations, for example, there isn't clear enough data there. But we draw on, again, further information, this time I think from England, that notes that around 40% of GP consultations in England are in respect of mental health concerns.
Okay.
So well, those two statistics are not the same thing, but it illustrates the scale of mental ill health in Scotland sufficiently.
So I was going to ask about GPs. So do we have an equivalent figure for Scotland, or do we just not know?
So again, we do not have a precise figure that can reliably say what GP engagement was in terms of mental ill health.
And why do we not have that? Why is that not recorded?
So Lee might want to say a bit more about this, given our review and commentary, and again, as Mr Beattie mentions, in successive reporting that we've done on the NHS, that we do not have in Scotland, despite having a very comprehensive statistical recording arrangement through NHS National Services Scotland, Information Services Division. Where we are lacking is in primary care information. Lee can say a bit more, I'm sure.
I guess just to agree with the Auditor General, we have commented on a number of occasions about the lack of data in primary care. Public Health Scotland are working on it. They are trying to improve that situation, but the data that's available right now is experimental, and they're trying to develop it so that it's more robust and reliable. But whether or not that will include how many appointments are to do with mental health remains to be seen. But yeah, we have commented on several occasions about the lack of insight and data into what is going on in general practice.
Because it's pretty fundamental, and it's it comes out very strongly in the report. This lack of data, a confused system. It's slow and complicated. People don't know where to go. You would think that if you Of course, mental health covers a wide range of things, but for many people, the first port of call could be the GP. But a GP is really set up to deal with it. I mean, it doesn't sound from your report that they are.
So, I'll maybe just bring to the committee's attention Exhibit 1 in the report. So we set out really effectively the patient journey in terms of people who are experiencing mental ill health. So from prevention and self-help, then, as you say, to primary care settings, and then if that's not helped or resolve or to manage conditions, onto secondary care and then specialist tertiary care. I would absolutely recognise, Mr Simpson, that the Scottish Government in their strategy have set out that increasing the provision of mental health services in primary care settings is fundamental to help tackle the problem. And their ambition to do so by 2026 is central to that. What we've noted in our report is that is at risk without provision of a clear costed delivery plan to get to that point, given the variables and also the starting point, as the report also notes, not just the lack of high quality information, but also, if I may say again, just some of the workforce challenges that are present to get to a comprehensive provision across the country in 3 years' time.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've mentioned a few times now this ambition that every GP practice will have somebody there who's a specialist in mental health. By 2026, every GP practice will have that. So where are we now? Do we know?
So I'll bring Lee in. Oh, sorry, Eva, apologies.
That's fine, I can, yeah, so I think one thing to note is that, based on the previous response as well, is that there isn't good quality primary care data out there, but an estimated 41% of GP appointments relate to mental health. So it's potentially significant, and that's based on, again, survey data, one-off kind of pieces of work. And I think the Royal College of GPs has also told us that they need more support to help tackle mental health. And so in terms of where they are now, a couple of surveys have taken place to find out how the proportion of GP practices in Scotland that have access to mental health workers. And in the last survey, it was estimated that 17% of GP practices across Scotland reported having no access to mental health workers. The year before, it was just 45% of GP practices reported having full access. And the difficulty with the most recent data is that it only counts any access at all. So that can range from minimal access to full access. So it's very difficult to say how many GP practices are in a position where they've got sufficient mental health workers.
What years are you referring to?
So the one where 45% of GP practices have full access, that was 2022. And then in 2023, we don't have that level of detail. So all we know is that 17% had no access.
So basically, last year, 45% of GP practices had some access.
45% had full access.
Full access.
Yes.
But we want to get to every practice having full access by 2026. So there's an awful long way to go. I just want to ask about one more area, if I can, and you refer in your report. It's on page 13, paragraph 16, which covers two pages. You refer to the number of police incidents relating to mental health, and I'm sure most MSPs all MSPs will be speaking to their local police, and it comes up every time you speak to them that the majority of their work now is taken up with mental health cases. I mean, I've heard figures ranging from 60 to 80%, quite stark, dealing with people with mental health and taking police away from other duties. Now, that's not the police's fault, and it's not the people with mental health issues. It's not their fault either. But it is a problem. So I'd wonder, did you speak to the police about this? Because it's a serious issue out there.
Yeah, so Eva can again say a bit more about just the engagement that we had during the course of the audit. But I think the point I would maybe just develop, Mr Simpson, for a moment is, so we're reporting that there's been a 62% increase in police mental health response incidents over the past 7 years. Clearly, hugely significant increase in their focus and attention. But it's also relevant as it relates to the financial position of the police, the prioritisation that organisation will have to make as it too looks to deliver a changing service and meets its own budget priorities. So we drew upon a range of sources and evidence as we're setting out, but again, Eva can say a bit more about our wider engagement.
Thank you. So we did speak to the police as part of our audit work early on in the audit. We haven't covered in detail the role of the police because the HMICS are actually publishing a report on policing mental health shortly. So we spoke to them about their work and we've kind of left it to them to publish that piece of work.
Sorry?
HMICS, the Inspectorate
Okay.
for Constabulary Scotland, I think.
Okay. Okay, I'll leave it there, convener. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go straight on now to Willie Coffey, who's got a series of questions to put to you. Willie.
Thanks very much again, convener, and good morning, Auditor General and colleagues. I had a range of questions, but I would like to stick with the one on the GP issue there that Graham Simpson was asking about. We've got a comment in the report from the Royal College of GPs saying that the GPs need more support. It's as stark as that to address mental health needs of patients. And some comment in the focus group, Eva, was saying that people seem to prefer the support they get from their GP rather than psychiatric services. And there's another bit in the report somewhere else that talks about access to mental health officers with the funding being there but not being taken up. So there's a whole range of issues swirling around here. Stephen, I wonder if you could just say a wee bit more about what your understanding of this particular issue is and what the GP is actually asking for.
Yeah, good morning, Mr Coffey. Happy to start. I'm sure Eva wanted to say a bit more about particularly the views of focus group participants and that of the Royal College. I think it's we set out in even our previous response. So we have just short of 50% of GPs currently having mental health provision. There's a long way to go over the course of the next 3 years to get to a full provision across a primary care setting. So as things currently stand, GPs are still providing that service, but without the additional skills and capacity within their practices to do so. Inevitably, that brings real pressure upon primary care practitioners to deliver the service. And that probably speaks to the views of the Royal College about just the challenges that their members are currently facing. We also, drawn on again, Eva will, I'm sure, want to develop this, is that there are different views about, from service users about kind of the best experience they can get. Some will refer to mental health officers, others note the quality of service they receive from the GP, and some note that this is just as competent from the multidisciplinary team that they can get over the course. But what we've had, really want to illustrate in today's report, Mr Coffey, is that there's a long way to go for the government to deliver upon its ambition to have that preventative primary care-based mental health service that is expected to deliver some of the results. And we draw on case studies from elsewhere in the world about where that has been targeted successfully. But I'll stop for a moment and bring Eva in to say some further.
Thanks, Auditor General. So in terms of the views from the focus groups, as the Auditor General said, it was mixed. And I think the point that came through strongly and the quote that you've kind of referred to was essentially illustrating the point that GPs play a significant role in people's kind of day-to-day health. So, you know, they see if someone needs a psychiatrist, they see the psychiatrist every so often, but that's not enough to kind of keep them well in between those appointments. For instance, they get more frequent, I guess, care from their GP and from, you know, community support groups and that kind of thing. And I think that's the direction of travel that we've kind of seen a demand for, where there's a range of support available for people, and they're not just relying on those kind of specialists for all of their support.
Okay, that's really helpful. It's a very difficult area to pin down here, and I'm just wondering if what we're actually saying is that the GPs themselves need to be more skilled to be able to deal with, or do they need access to that skill to be brought into their practices a bit more closely? Is that what we're saying?
I don't know if we're saying it with quite that precision, actually, and I'm sure that might be a view maybe better expressed by GPs and their representatives themselves. I think what we've assessed that the expansion of mental health services in primary care, yes, will involve GPs, but also that multidisciplinary team of service providers, whether it's psychologists, mental health nurses, mental health officers, so that there will be a tailored approach to individual requirements.
Thank you for that. I wonder, before I move on to a couple of these other queries that I have, do you know if there's a diagnostic pathway for adults with ADHD? And I deliberately ask this because of a number of constituency casework that are coming to me, that there appears to be none. I wonder if any colleagues could help us with that query, and is there any work going on to try to address that?
Yeah, maybe Eva can say that. It wasn't a specific focus of the report in terms of the provision. We do refer to in the report the extent of prescribing drug usage to treat certain conditions, Mr. Coffey, but our ability to draw conclusions on specific mental health illnesses, we deliberately sought to make it an overall assessment of provision, but Eva may be able just to help with that further.
Yeah, I was essentially going to make that point, that we didn't look at specific conditions as part of our audit work, but it has come up that, you know, people with ADHD are struggling to kind of get the assessments and things that they need.
Particularly adults, because there is a process for younger people, but when it comes to the adult population, there appears to be no pathway to diagnosis. Christine, is there anything you are familiar with that might help?
No, what I would say is we made, as Eva said, a deliberate decision at the start of scoping this audit that we weren't going to make it diagnostic specific. We were just going to cover the whole range. But I think it's worth, as well as thinking about those suffering from ADHD, is dementia and Alzheimer's. That's a huge, takes up a huge amount of service provision, and quite often it's the same services that are providing to other elements of the mental health care in a community setting. So it's, your point's well made about specific conditions, but I would also like to say, you know, that really adult dementia takes up a huge amount, and they're by and large the same services that are being used across the piece: primary care, support groups, peer groups, third sector, that sort of.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Stephen, your report tells us that access to a range of mental health services dipped obviously during COVID, and is kind of by and large gone back to those pre-pandemic levels, but not for psychiatry services, it seems to be saying there. Have you any views on why that would be the case, why the number of psychiatry appointments has decreased and other services have kind of recovered to their pre-pandemic levels?
Yeah, Mr. Coffey, you're right. I think you're referring to Exhibit 2 in the report, where we set out the change in activity across a range of different mental health specialisms between October, December 2017 through to the end of last year. I think, as the committee would expect, and you'll have seen from previous reports on NHS activity, there was a considerable drop, and then largely consistent, I think, what we reported in previous NHS overview reports, that activity recovered across a range of specialisms. On specifics with psychiatry, again, colleagues may kind of want to say a bit further about this, but that's been one of the key challenges in terms of recruitment and retention of specialisms. We note in the report, Mr Coffey, that what we've seen is that because there are so few specialists in this area, that some NHS boards are recruiting from one another to make this provision. So it's perhaps a longer term review that is required about, as part of the workforce considerations, how are people coming into that specialism, how are they retained, and that as part of that costed workforce financial plan that's needed across the piece to ensure that consistency of service provision across specialisms. Again, Eva might want to say a bit further.
Thank you. Yeah. So psychiatry is one of the areas where the availability of information is very limited. So the number of appointments are published, but there's no information about number of referrals, waiting times, how long people are waiting, etc. So it's very, very difficult to say why appointments are going down. It's very likely that the challenges with recruitment and retention that the Auditor General has set out is one of the reasons, but without further information it's very difficult to come to a judgment about, we don't know whether, for instance, the number of people being referred has decreased or increased, but the Royal College of Psychiatrists has told us that demand is high. So they've done some specific pieces of work in I think Glasgow, so we've not been able to look to see that data, but they are telling us that demand is high.
Okay, thank you for that. Turning to there's a really interesting table in here about access to the services through digital means. Even as usual, it highlights quite a difference right across Scotland in terms of whether consultations are digital or face-to-face and so on. And I was taken by the Ayrshire and Arran figure being the highest in Scotland for face-to-face. Could you just offer some ideas on what's going on there? Why is it so varied across Scotland? And is there any observed impact on the difference between face-to-face versus digital?
I think the why is the harder part to answer, Mr Coffey. Actually, what we've always again set out at Exhibit 3 is the psychological therapy variation that takes place across Scotland. You're right to highlight Ayrshire and Arran as the highest for face-to-face at 86% of recorded appointments. And then at the other ends of the extreme that we have NHS Orkney with 94% of virtual appointments. The most important thing about this, and again consistent with government strategy, is that patients have choice about how they receive psychological therapies. Perhaps like some of the other focus group commentary, Mr Coffey, is that there wasn't a universal picture from people we spoke to. For some, they said that actually a virtual appointment was what they wanted. It increased the speed with which they were able to access services. But others saying it's not right for them. They get much more benefit. So the primary path has to be that patient choice is seen in terms of the access to services they want. Why it is what it is, again, is the more limited component of the information that's available to us. And indeed, it may be an area, excuse me, that the committee, should you decide to explore further, would wish to look at.
Mm. Do you see that continuing, that model of mixed, hybrid face-to-face, just continuing for the foreseeable? Do you see that just becoming the norm, that there's a choice available to people to choose whether it's face-to-face or digital? I mean, in Orkney it sounds as though it's not really a choice, it's a necessity to do a lot of digital access by the sounds of it.
I'll say a wee bit further, actually, and again, Christine and Eva might want to say further, just to highlight for the committee that we currently have an audit underway on digital exclusion, and that given the pace of change that is existing on the provision of public services, that whether it's accessing mental health services or other parts of public service, that as we move to a digital service provision, that goes at the right pace and respects different choices and different benefits that come from both digital and a face-to-face model, Mr Coffey. So we'll be reporting to the committee, together myself and the Accounts Commission, in early 2024 on that. But I'll stop on that for a moment, actually, and Eva and Christine may wish to say further.
Do you want to give us?
Yeah, I think it's access to digital that may account for some things. And people don't have the means, they don't have broadband, they don't have the infrastructure around them to be able to do that. They may not be able to do that very easily because of a language difficulty or something like that. So maybe face-to-face is better for them in that instance. But digital exclusion is a big issue, and as Stephen said, we're doing work on that now. So around whether it's equal across the piece, it definitely isn't, even on a geographical basis. Never mind the other inequalities we've mentioned. So I would say its choice is first, but actually, if you're in crisis, you want what's quickest. And sometimes it might be quicker for the digital intervention than it is for the face-to-face intervention. But I don't have any evidence to support that.
I'm just looking at the chart again there, Stephen and Christine. The Orkney Shetland picture is almost the opposite of one another in terms of digital or face-to-face. It seems to be almost the polar opposite in both. The Western Isles there is incredibly high in terms of digital telephone video access rather than face-to-face. So it's quite differences within the rural setting and the islands there. It's very different picture. Anyway, I'll leave that query there for another day. Just lastly from me, convener, another point in your report, Stephen, in paragraph 29, you talk about the government issuing its planning guidance to the IJBs, integrated joint boards and so on and so forth, as part of their improvement in mental health and wellbeing care services. But we were expecting the report, I think, in April 22. It's not appeared yet, is that? Could you offer some more comments on that and when we might expect it?
Yeah, you're right, Mr Coffey. I think I'll maybe quickly pass on to Christine, given the Accounts Commission's role in overseeing the work of IJBs. But absolutely, so I think, as we've touched on, I guess, a number of times already, that guidance and strategies are important, but actually giving clear guidance on what's to be delivered and how it's to be delivered, evaluated, the information that's to be collected, is the underpinning that is needed for IJBs and other service providers to take that next step to effectively implement the strategy ambitions. Christine.
Yeah, thanks. IGBs have the job of commissioning the services that are then delivered by the health and social care partnerships, who are then staffed by councils, third sector and the NHS, depending on which strand they come from. So you see the difficulty there. But I think IJBs definitely have a role in drawing everything together, because the money goes into that pot and then they can decide in their locality how it's best spent. So whether they liaise via housing, whether it's transitions, because that's the other thing, child and adolescent mental health become adults eventually, how they manage that, those services. So IJBs definitely have a role in that, but the delivery of it is through the workforce of the local authority and the NHS. And again, we have issues there with which we've alluded to about workforce and workforce planning in that area.
Do we have a date for publication of that guidance?
I don't have a date.
So we don't know when that's due to come out, but like you mentioned, it was due out last year as part of the commitment to establish those primary care mental health and wellbeing services by 2026. That was what the guidance was for. It was to measure outcomes from those services. So we would like to see that either as a separate document as originally planned, or built into another kind of delivery plan that they're planning at the moment. So we've recommended in that paragraph there that should be published as soon as possible.
Okay.
Can I just say something about measuring outcomes? Because it's really important that the outcomes are the individual's outcomes and not the outcomes that the service feels they can deliver. And I think that's really crucial in mental health above everything else, because it might be something quite simple in case of anxiety in terms of, dealing with that. and it's that individual's outcome. So how you measure that is incredibly difficult, and how you audit it, we're still trying to get to grips with. We are doing some work between us and with Public Health Scotland as well to try and get a bit more of a handle on real life outcomes as opposed to audited financial outcomes, etc.
But see, for years, we've just never asked people how they feel about the treatment and services they've got. We've never asked.
And there's a
That's a
stigma
lot.
attached to speaking
Right.
about mental health as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
said earlier about 1 in 4, that means maybe in this room. But it might be true in this room, but there's a stigma attached to talking about it. It's not like having a broken leg or a sore hip. And I think, again, we have to recognise that and be open about it.
Just to say one word on it, Mr. Coffey, is that we risk overcomplicating these things. That is really, did it make a difference? Christine's right. Did it make a difference to the person that received the service? And we can say, yes, it did. Great, we'll continue doing that. Or you take an evaluation approach, say, well, what different things can we do? These are the next steps that we've talked about. And just one other thing, I just say one thing. One other thing that is that inevitably this is going to require work across partners. So Scottish Government, councils, health boards, and so on. That in itself is easy to sign up to, but actually having a clear shared plan, a shared accountability is also vital.
Okay. Thank you very much for all Christine. Come back.
Anecdotal evidence into this. Self-directed support, which is a welfare payment, that in Murray, when I was involved, we had a client who used their self-directed support payment to buy a fish tank, to put fish in. And that solved their anxiety problem. It gave them something to get up for in the morning. And that was their outcome. It worked for them. And in terms of, best use of public funds, it was great use of public funds, because it lasted for as long as the fish, and then he went and got more fish, And genuinely, that's the sort of thing that makes a difference to people's lives, that they can get up in the morning, they've got something to look forward to and something to relax about. And that's the sort of level of outcomes we should really be trying to look at.
That's a lovely story to share with the committee.
Hope that
Christine,
helps
thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for your responses to those questions. Back to you, convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid I'm going to bring us back to the institutional architecture and all that, because one of the things that I kind of take from the report is that you do seem to bring out a view about where are the IJBs in all of this. So a lot of attention is on the health board's outcomes and the local authorities' outcomes. But the IJBs are supposed to straddle that and pull that together and integrate that, literally. Do you want to say a word or two about what conclusions you drew from the work you did about the role of the IJBs?
I'll be brief, convener, and Christine, I'm sure, will say more than me. But what is clear in the report is that the accountability seems mismatched. So, so the funding, whilst commissioned to, through to the IJBs, the accountability itself seems to rest with the health boards from the Scottish Government's funding direction. That needs to be resolved if we are to have one of those effective pillars of how public spending can be delivered more effectively. Christine.
Yeah, thank you. IJBs don't get funded directly. Their funding comes from the council, the local authorities, and from the NHS boards. So it has to trickle through that and then through into their commission services. So therein is another difficult problem, because they have to work in commissioning these services on an annual budget, but ahead 3-5 years. When we're asking councils and IJBs, when we're auditing them, we're asking them for medium and long-term financial planning. So they have to be doing that with an annual dollop of money. When it goes into the IJB, it's supposed to be used in a way that's specific for that locale. So where I live, it would be very different. And are they held accountable? I'm not sure about that. I think it's very difficult. It's complicated. It's not well understood. I've been at committees here before in this place, and I struggle to see that there's been any change in the understanding of what an IJB can do and what it's able to do. So there's no doubt about it. The IJBs and whatever follow them in the next iteration of what's coming, then that needs to be very, very keenly thought of, because it can't be done as it's being done now in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were described in Parliament just last week as being quite a mixed bag. So I don't know whether you've discerned from the auditing work you've done that in some areas the IJBs are accountable, are working well, whereas in others they aren't. You don't need to name them, but do you get that sense that there are different performances in different parts of the country?
I think we do, but they have different challenges and they work within different communities. In some smaller local rural communities are much more focused on coming together and working together to help with the challenges that are in that specific location. I'm thinking about remote and rural areas in particular. Actually, inner city areas are the same. You look at Dundee and some of the community work that's being done there. So they are very different, but by their very nature, I think there's 31 of them. You know, they can't help but be different, and therein is the challenge. But there is a challenge around workforce planning and leadership as well. You know, how do you find 31 leaders to deal with that environment on a day-in, day-out basis? It's very difficult.
Yeah, maybe not. I mean, ultimately, if we're creating these institutions and Parliament is legislating to set up a way of delivering services, then we would expect that there would be the leadership necessary to drive that forward, I think. And as a Public Audit Committee, I guess that's what we would expect as well.
And our focus going for our strategy as the Accounts Commission, we will be looking very much at leadership going forward, and whether or not we have the available workforce and the way of recognising it.
Good. I'm conscious of the time, and we've still got some important areas to cover. But can I just very quickly, as we're on local government, ask about the Verity House agreement? And Auditor General, I'll start with you, just to give your assessment of whether you think that will make a difference in the delivery of mental health services.
I'm probably not in a position to reach a view on it yet, Convener. I think what we've seen is a statement of intent from Scottish Government and COSLA in terms of funding, accountability, talk of a fiscal framework. From what I understand, there is much work happening to do before that's set out more clearly over the course of the next few months about how that will operate in practice. So I look forward to seeing further detail. But if it is to act as a template for more accountability for where decisions are taken, that can be a helpful thing. As linking back to today's report, we've set out that it is quite a cluttered, unclear, complex governance accountability landscape. And if this helps bring clarity to how services will be delivered and associated accountability, we'd welcome that. But I look forward to seeing more detail.
Thanks. And to Christine Lester, I mean, is the Accounts Commission going to be monitoring the Verity House agreement and its outcomes?
I don't really think that's our role. We're looking very carefully at it. We're speaking to local authorities about it. And again, the prospect of a fiscal framework would be very, very welcome in terms of what we've already discussed about commissioning services for the longer term and being able to sustain them over a greater than a 12-month period.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Can I just turn a little bit again to progress towards improving mental health services? And just can you tell us a bit more about the support which the Scottish Government has been providing to NHS boards to help them meet their psychological therapies waiting time targets, which is highlighted in the report?
Yes, I can, Convener, and I'm going to bring Lee in to say a bit more detail in this. I think in overall terms, we set out at paragraph 45 that there's a 90% target to deliver psychological therapy waiting times. Going to develop that in the exhibit that to date none of the NHS board areas in Scotland are meeting that target to varying degrees. The support provided, though, is set out in paragraph 47. There has been provided tailored support to some NHS boards. We note in NHS Grampian, for example, back to the point we discussed with Mr Coffey, that the availability of really specialist individuals can impact upon the performance of the health board in the round. So again, it comes back to workforce plan, longer term plans in the future, but also actions in the short term. But I'll pass to Lee if anything further she wishes to share with the committee.
I don't have much to add, just to say that obviously that support was tailored to the different areas that received it. So it would be very much based on their local circumstances and their local needs, but very much focused on trying to reduce those, the waits for people who've been waiting the longest. And we, in our case study there, in terms of NHS Grampian, we do give an outline. Some of their improvements were delayed because they were waiting for a long time for a director of psychology to help it make improvements there. They were also facing some challenges around the quality of the data that was supporting their psychological therapies output, and they've since tried to improve that by implementing a new system that will gather more robust data that will give them better insight into what's going on.
Thanks, Lee. I mean, you mentioned Grampian. Also highlighted in the report is Tayside. And Tayside has been the subject of not just local but national interest because of some of the tragic cases there of people who have completed suicide, for example. So I think in the case study, you characterise things as being in a state of making good progress. I think when the Strang report came out, subsequent to that, there was an assurance board, oversight and assurance group put together to ensure that the health board was implementing the recommendations of the Strang review. And I think there were 51 recommendations. But as I read that oversight and assurance group report when it came out in January, they were echoing some of the points that Strang had made, that there was an over-reporting of progress by NHS Tayside in this area of service. And I think in 17 areas, in 17 out of the 51 recommendations, they were taking issue with the health board's view of how well it was doing, basically saying you're not making the progress that you are stating that you are making. So I just wonder whether you want to reflect on that, given it's in the report.
Yeah, very happy to, Convener. I think we set out case study 4, really the history of mental health service provision in NHS Tayside, the very well documented challenges that the health board was having, the challenges in relationships that it was having with service users and the local community, and then Strang's review of services followed by the independent oversight. I think what we've tried to do is set a fairly factual assessment of the current circumstances and progress. So whilst there has been progress in some areas, I think it's also perhaps worth just to record that we do note that there are also areas where little progress has been made in respect of governance, public performance reporting, which perhaps speaks to the point that you're making, and still work to do in terms of building trust with communities who are using the service. We have an audit role in some of this, so we are continuing to track progress again that the board is making through the annual audit, and again are giving thought to when would be the best time to undertake some further parliamentary reporting on that, alongside opportunities that exist in our wider NHS overview reporting. So we're reflecting on that. None of that says that the audit role is only one component of it, Convener. Of course, the accountability for progress rests, yes, with the health board, the accountable officer of the health board, with the IGB and their local authority partners. So I how best to characterise it? I think there has been progress in some areas, but still important work to do. And again, we look to set out that fairly factually in the case study within the report.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that response. We are pressed for time. Willie Coffey, have you got a question you want to come in on? So I'll bring you in next, and I'll bring in Sharon, and I'll bring in Graham if we've got time at the end.
Thanks, Convener. It's just the one question I have, Stephen. It's about the 10% target, you know, to deliver frontline and mental health spending by 2026. And it's the misunderstanding, I think, or the lack of clarity between what counts as frontline and what counts as mental health services, so we can properly account and report that. Could you say where we are with that, and are we making any progress in making it a bit clearer for the boards and so on to be able to report for us?
Yeah, I'll do my best to try and set that out for the committee. I think we cover this in paragraph 67 to the report, where reflecting the government's ambition that by 2026, 10% of frontline spending by NHS boards should be on mental health service provision, and NHS boards were asked to, in their current year annual delivery plans, which is a return that boards make to the Scottish Government on their intentions, required to say what their current percentage was. However, this resulted in confusion because the Scottish Government or boards, there wasn't an agreed or shared definition of what was frontline mental health spending. So the government is currently reviewing that to better define in their guidance what they consider to be frontline spending. Lee might want to say, or Eva, I think it is, actually a little bit more about kind of where we're currently at in terms of progress towards 10%. There is some signs of going back slightly again on an overall assessed definition. So some work to do both in a definition and progress to the overall target. Mr. Coffey. You.
Thank you. As the Auditor General said, that this was originally expected as part of their submissions for the annual delivery plans, but because of some kind of confusion about definitions, that work is still ongoing. So the Scottish Government is currently working with boards to get those trajectories in place. We were hoping to see it just before we published the report. Unfortunately, it didn't come through in time. So hopefully in the next few weeks, we'd hope to see those trajectories in place.
Okay, look forward to that. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks very much. And Deputy Convener, Sharon Dowie's got some questions. Sharon.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Paragraphs 77 and 78 on page 41 of the report raised concerns that pressure on staff is increasing because of high vacancy and turnover rates and difficulties in filling vacancies. And it cites a national shortage of psychologists. Vacancies for general psychiatry consultants are the highest of all medical and dental consultant roles in Scotland, and vacancies for mental health nurses have more than doubled between March 2017 and March 2023, and turnover there has reached a record high. So could you tell me what action the Scottish Government is taking to support NHS boards facing those issues?
Yeah, Eva can come in a moment to say about the actions that the Government is taking. I'll say two things first, actually, is that there needs to be a comprehensive workforce plan so that health boards, the government and their partners can work towards the delivery of the strategy. You're right, Deputy Convener, that a report builds on the views of those working in the provision of adult mental health services, that the system is under real strain. We set out some of the vacancy rates, turnover, and the fact that very specialist people are in short supply. So health boards are competing for these skills, and that has an impact on ultimately the services that patients are looking for, and perhaps speaks to some of the regional variation elements that we've covered already this morning. The government's steps, though, again, Eva can say a bit more about kind of what planned and timescales for that.
Thank you, Auditor General. So as Stephen mentioned, there needs to be a workforce plan. So the Scottish Government is currently planning to publish a workforce action plan alongside the delivery plan for the new mental health and wellbeing strategy this autumn. Again, we haven't seen that yet, so we don't know how detailed that will be, but in that we would hope to see detail about how exactly they're going to tackle these really quite challenging vacancies and workforce position. I think another element that might be worth mentioning is although these specialist roles are really, really critical and there absolutely needs to be a plan in place to try and address these vacancies, there's also a role for sort of new, innovative, slightly different roles to try and ease pressure on those specialist services. And part of that's through the mental health and wellbeing services and primary care. But also we've illustrated in the report examples where boards are kind of employing these kind of newer roles to try and address some of those recruitment challenges.
Thank you. The Royal College of Psychiatrists also raised concerns during the audit that most NHS boards rely on locums who are not consultants to fill vacant consultant psychiatry posts. Do you know the extent to which this is happening, and also whether an assessment's been made of any risk that that could present?
We don't have that detail. That was a concern raised by the Royal College of Psychiatrists to us. They highlighted that as a challenge. So they have the detail on that.
Okay, thanks. The other thing you'd mentioned there about the workforce plan, and we're waiting on a report coming out. I'm always interested in whether the workforce plan equals funded places at universities and colleges. So it's interesting, do you know why there's not enough student coming into mental health nursing? Because seemingly there has been an increase in funded places, but we still can't get enough people in.
So I think it's a really important area for the health system to resolve. I think we touched on the report that NHS Education for Scotland are involved in tackling this issue. Tackling it and it being tackled is the important next step, whether it's about promotion, interest, changes in behaviours of prospective students, all have to be looked at, Deputy Convener. I think what we've set out in today's report is the circumstances that the system currently finds itself in. There is alert to it. The effectiveness of their next steps and what their planned steps are, yes, will be part of the funded, the action plan. But again, it may be an area of interest that the committee might want to explore directly with those NHS bodies.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And moving on to plans and strategic direction, how realistic are the Scottish Government's commitments to increase the Mental Health Directorate budget by 25% and ensure 10% of the frontline NHS budget is spent on mental health by 2026, given the financial constraints highlighted in your report?
So you're right, we highlight the financial constraints that the Scottish budget is facing, and indeed we've done in many of our recent reports over the past 18 months or so. Ultimately, this will come down to prioritisation that the government wishes to make and a parliamentary consideration of the budget. Whether that is consistent with the aims of increasing mental health service provision in primary care settings or 10% of spending will all have to be balanced up. These are the levers that the government and parliament have at their disposal as they set priorities. What's clear though, and I think as we touched on in some of the earlier discussion about other parts of public services will risk not being prioritised while health spending is prioritised. We've talked for many years in our NHS overview reporting that the system as it currently operates isn't sustainable. So public sector reform has to move at a faster pace. Building on Christine's point from earlier, we have to get to from a reactive part of the system to a more preventative spend that requires NHS, councils, IJBs, third sector providers to come up with a different plan fundamentally than the one that we're currently operating on. But it goes back to choices and priorities, Deputy Convener, to continue progressing with this will require prioritisation that may not favour other parts of public spending.
Which goes back to your comment on difficult decisions will need to be made. We note that a delivery plan and a mental health workforce plan are expected to be published by the Scottish Government this autumn, which will set out how and when the priorities in the Joint Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy published with COSLA will be achieved. Do you have an update on the timings of the publication of the documents?
I don't think we do. I think autumn is the most up-to-date information that we have. So I assume, like the committee, we'll be very keen to see that it's consistent with the findings and recommendations that we make in today's report.
Okay, thanks. And my final question. Can you tell us more about what the Scottish Government, alongside its health and social care partners, could learn from NHS England to improve its financial, workforce and operational data in relation to mental health services? And that was in paragraph 98, page 47.
Thank you. Yes, we do. And I think what we tried to do in the report is to, another audit work that we have underway is evaluating where there's options for applied learning from where it's been done in other jurisdictions. I think the one caveat I would make before saying a bit further, and Lee again might want to say a bit more about how NHS England is operating, is that we've not seen any perfect model. So whilst we draw on NHS England and one of our case studies from Trieste in Italy about the provision of services, we also note that there isn't a perfect set of circumstances for the provision of high-quality adult mental health services. What we have seen in England, though, and Lee can say more, is that their use of data is at a further along a starting point than we've seen for NHS Scotland in terms of primary care. So building on that learning, and we know very clearly that NHS Scotland do speak to their colleagues in NHS England to bring some of that back. Can that be applied successfully, effectively here in Scotland too? Lee.
Thank you, Auditor General. Just to build on what Stephen was saying, I think it's important to recognise that NHS England still faces a number of data quality and completeness issues. So again, it's not perfect, but they are collecting a greater range of data than we currently have available in terms of spending, activity across a range of different services, looking at inequalities, as well as one of the things that they look at is a recovery rate for people who have engaged in some psychological talking type therapies. So I think what we're just trying to say in the report is that we could possibly learn something from NHS England in terms of the range of different data that they currently collect and the different types of things that they're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. We are very tight for time. Graham, if you've got a very quick question, you can have the final question.
Thanks, Convener. It will be quick. It's something we've not touched on yet, and that is the cost of drugs to treat people with mental health problems. And I read recently that there's been an explosion in the use of antidepressants. We're now up to 1 million people in Scotland, 1 million adults in Scotland are on antidepressants, which almost gets us to that 1 in 4 figure that we mentioned earlier. But there's a huge cost to all this as well, and I just wonder whether you've done any analysis of that.
So I recognise the reference you make to the cost of antidepressants. I think we saw some commentary input around that over the past couple of weeks. So I think we mentioned earlier, we didn't focus on individual conditions during the course of this audit, but paragraph 75, what we've set out in it, is perhaps not the expected result. So we see that spending on mental health medicines in a community setting fell in real terms, Mr Simpson, from 117 million in 2017-18 to 90.4 million in 21-22. But at the same time, we're seeing an increase in the number of items that are being prescribed. So it's consistent with the point that you make, but it leads us to a conclusion, and we've not done audit work or evidence, but an interim conclusion that the cost of medicines for some conditions, mental, have fallen, but the scale of access is still high and increasing.
So the cost of the medicine is falling, but the number of people using them may have risen.
Yes.
Okay, maybe something we should look at. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And can I thank Auditor General, you for the evidence you've led this morning, along with Lee Johnson, Eva Thomas-Tudo and Christine Lester from the Accounts Commission. Can I thank you all very much for giving of your time and your thoughts and your reflections and giving us some very useful evidence that we will now consider and decide what next steps we want to take on this hugely important area. And may I say, I do think this is one of the strongest reports that you've produced, certainly in my time as the convener of the Public Audit Committee. It's very, very clearly driven by the evidence and has reached some pretty stark conclusions that I think all of us as members of the Scottish Parliament will need to reflect on. So can I thank you very much indeed, and I will now move the meeting into private session.